For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Madiba. South African cartoonist Jonathan Zapiro, known as Zapiro, joins me to discuss his book titled Which Side Is Up? Give us some background into how Jonathan Zapiro became Zapiro, from where you grew up. How did you get into drawing cartoons to where you are now?
I think everyone's a cartoonist when you know, from the age of 3 or 4. My drawings were no different to anybody else's. But I think over the years I carried on. That's what we cartoonists do. I think by the time I was 8 or 9, I actually really knew I wanted to be a cartoonist. Grew up in Cape Town in a fairly progressive but not activist household. A household where, certainly from my mother, but also from my father, we knew that things were deeply wrong with the country. We, as children, we didn't know what that really meant. We knew that there was a system of racial oppression. It took me many, many years, right through my schooling, even to absorb all of that I understood, and until I got to the point, so many years later, where I started actually doing something about it. In a way, I understood for so many years, and I felt I was kind of apathetic. Well, not apathetic, but I just wasn't really, I didn't know where to go to do anything. Although I wanted to be a cartoonist, I was also trying to avoid the army. So when I left school, I went to study architecture, mainly to stay out of the army, I have to say. I did enjoy the drawing and technical drawing and things like that in architecture. Learning to think in metaphor, which is something you do in architecture, but I was sort of looking for a way out, and so I could become a cartoonist. In your 4th year in architecture, they get you to work and to travel if you can. I traveled in Europe, and I decided to go and try and meet a couple of major cartoonists and see whether I could actually think about taking that drastic step, knowing that the army would be breathing down my neck. I managed to meet Uderzo, the great cartoon artist of Asterix. I actually rang his doorbell at 11 o'clock at night, unannounced, in Paris, which is unbelievably rude. I got lost, you see, and he invited me into his home. I mean, he invited me in. We talked for 10, 15 minutes with the help of his daughter, who was studying English. He didn't speak English. I didn't speak French. But it was an amazingly powerful moment for me. And when I came back to South Africa, it's one of the reasons, not the reasons, one of the reasons I said, okay, that's enough. Now I'm actually going to go, and no matter how hard it is, I'm going to start to become a cartoonist. I went to study graphic design. The army then conscripted me, and that was quite catastrophic because they pulled me out of university, and I went to the army, refused to carry a gun, was eventually given a lead pole to carry. I even stood guard with my lead pole, which was really weird, just once, because I wasn't meant to, and that was funny. And the funny bit was, I started to kind of see myself as a bit of a walking cartoon, and able to sort of satirize the system a bit from inside. And then the other fortuitous thing is that the United Democratic Front formed while I was in the army, and I immediately got involved, also immediately got arrested. So my first arrest was in the army, and I was arrested a couple of times. There was a case that ran through many months. I was convicted of illegal gathering in cars. Our group was the first people ever to be convicted of illegal gathering for gathering in cars. We were in a motorcade. I then went on to be involved in the conscription campaign a bit. I designed the logo for the ECC, started doing odd jobs in cartooning to keep myself above water just a little bit, very hand-to-mouth existence, but working for any organizations that needed drawings. Taught myself. Then worked for South newspaper when they started in 1987, and then managed to get a scholarship to study in America. And the background, the other weird thing is that just before I left for America is when the security police caught up with me and detained me without trial. And it turned out they detained me because they thought there were two Jonathan Shapiros in our little group, and they thought I was the other one. And then one day when I was gone, they detained him because they thought he was me, so we were quits. But I was in solitary confinement even for a little while, and I just got a sense of a tiny little feeling of persecution, but obviously I was very much protected by my privileged background and white skin, but it gave me an insight into struggle, those years of involvement. After I came back from America, I did educational comics for 3 years. We did an AIDS education comic as early as 1992. I mean, early for South Africa. Then we did a child abuse prevention comic called A Trolley Full of Rights, which has been used by UNICEF since. And then we did a democracy education comic. And then in 1994, I was invited to be the cartoonist for Mail and Guardian, just before our democratic elections, first democratic elections. And then I was in the Sowetan, and suddenly I was an editorial cartoonist. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
This is your 24th annual book. South African politics is always providing great content for journalists and political commentators, so there is no shortage. But as a cartoonist, how do you ensure that your content is kept relevant?
Yeah, it's a good question. I live in Cape Town, and so first of all, I'm in a fairly leafy suburb in Cape Town, and I have to try and keep in touch with what's going on in South Africa. Not always easy. I read as much as I can online. I still read some newspapers. I listen to a lot of radio. I speak to people. I speak to some of my journalist friends. But that doesn't mean that I'm always in touch with everything that people everywhere are talking about. So, I do my best. I suppose what I do, the cartoons that I do, are a very personal version of what's happening around. I'm able to keep very well in touch with the politics. And I'm able to try and keep in touch with what are the general memes or the vehicles with which I can say things. I think general attitudes, that is the hardest. I also come to Johannesburg a fair bit. Joburg has got a real vibe to it, which is, it's difficult in Cape Town to get that sense of kind of new South Africa that you get in Johannesburg. So that's one of the things I try and speak to people a lot when I'm here.
You are now a Knight in the Orders of Arts and Letters, a prestigious cultural award in France. How do you feel about this achievement and its reflection on your work?
I'll try and say it in French. My French is terrible. Chevalier des Arts et Lettres. It's, a Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters. Wow. I feel very, very honored, and I'm very, very lucky that I've received this recognition from somewhere overseas. But the more I think about it, the more I am happy that it is the French, because in my acceptance speech, when I was writing that, I was starting to think about how much of our ideas, concepts of freedom and concepts of freedom of expression were nurtured in France. From the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and then they came under stress. Those very ideas came under pressure within half a century. You then had the great, great caricaturist and cartoonist and artist Daumier, who was probably the greatest of the age anywhere in the world, who was right there, and he was actually arrested for something that he did just under 50 years after the French Revolution. And there were others, like a man called Philippon, who I talked about at my award ceremony, where he drew the King Louis Philippe as a pear, and this was an insult, because pear also meant somebody stupid or simpleton or dunce. So you had that kind of thing happening in France already back then. And then the other connection is that in 2015, the worst attack ever on cartoonists happened in Paris, in France. The Charlie Hebdo cartoonists were massacred, 5 of them and 7 other people. And at the very same time as that was happening, there was a planned assassination on me here in South Africa. So, and also by jihadist groups. It was a jihadist group that killed them and jihadist people who were planning to kill me. So all the connections are very, very strong. And the other great thing for me is that it puts me in the company of amazing people in South Africa and in other parts of the world who've received this award. In South Africa, Johnny Clegg, Zanele Maholi, William Kentridge, people like that. And other parts of the world, Angelique Kidjo, Steven Spielberg, Susan Sontag. So, yeah, very lucky.
And in presenting you with the award, the French ambassador said that satirically cartoonists play with fire in their work. Do you think so?
I couldn't agree more. And I think that the ambassador, whose name happens to be Le Chevalier, his surname, so he's kind of got the knight in his very name. He put so much thought and effort and emotion into his speech. I think I was lucky enough to be the recipient of an award where probably the best speech about cartooning that I've ever heard or read was made right there for me. So when he said playing with fire, he then talked about that fire and how it can take if the fire burns too brightly, if you go too far, you can cause hurt and harm. If you don't go far enough, you're not funny, you're not relevant. If you, and then he also used the image of the archer, and the cartoonists are firing into that little bullseye, and you've got to hit that bullseye. And if you do hit the mark, it's something that can be very powerful on someone who needs to be taken down a peg or two, but it's also something that ordinary people and friends and colleagues will start passing around, and it can actually spread a kind of a love. It can also show the face of ugliness, of the ugliness of the human spirit. So, I mean, it was a very profound speech that he wrote, and yeah, I'll certainly be using that a lot.
And with your cartoons, and especially with them being political, how do you draw the line between being funny and being editorially correct?
The term I would use is politically correct, and I really don't like political correctness. The way I've tried to think about it, I've avoided political correctness in the last many years. I think I started out being a little bit politically correct because I was ideologically linked to left-wing groups and to the movement, the UDF, the ANC, and in some ways I didn't have too much time or energy or need to get beyond what the broad aims of national liberation were. And then I didn't have to do too much on those the peripheries where things could kind of mess up my general direction of trying to get national liberation. So in a sense, I was perhaps a bit too politically correct back in those days. I'm talking about through the 80s. But as I got to the United States and I was studying and I was seeing things that happened in other parts of the world, I started to understand that I think it's important to be irreverent, even more irreverent than I had been. And to really, and I mean, for example, on things like religion, I really started pushing very hard all different religions, because many religions and many religious demagogues are homophobic, are against women's rights and women's reproductive rights, are very exclusive and think that everybody has to believe what they believe and that sort of thing. So I started to push very, very hard, and I'm very against political correctness. The one qualification I'd say is that in the last few years, with the rise of social media, things can get taken out of context so easily and can be distorted and sort of viciously twisted and used back at you. Even one sentence or part of a sentence or one drawing, even if you've done 30 years of work that may be seen by some people as progressive, you can suddenly be called a reactionary or a racist or a whatever. That kind of thing has happened to me, and it's been very, very difficult. So in these last few years, I've started to think about the difference between self-censorship and emotional intelligence. And I just said that self-censorship would be if you stop saying what you would say politically, you go on a completely different direction because you're scared and you don't want to sort of offend people too much. But emotional intelligence in that context could be that you still want to say something equally harshly, but if one metaphor is going to cause so much damage and take so much away from what you're trying to say politically, then I'll try and find another metaphor to say, another way of saying the same thing. And I think, so that's the kind of stuff that I've had to try and deal with in the last few years. And it's been very difficult, I have to say.
And can you tell us about your latest release, Which Side is Up? How does this book sum up South Africa's politics in 2019?
Each book every year would be, it's a continuum. I mean, it's my 24th annual, and every single book would be one where I'm just pulling together the best cartoons that I've done during the year, sometimes reordering them a little bit so they tell a story properly, and then put a little bit of context. I want the context to be able to be understood in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. Somebody picks up the book, or in another country, or somebody quite young who doesn't understand those issues fully. I try and kind of get that balance right. This particular one, Which Side is Up, came out of a cartoon that I did for our election, because I was really a bit annoyed that there were people preaching to me saying, you have to vote for Cyril. You have to vote ANC because now we're trying to get away from Zuma and Cyril is our only hope and therefore you must vote for Cyril. I'm saying, hang on a second. You look at that image, Which Side is Up? It stems from ace, because the ace means I'm going to do a playing card, and the ace is down at the moment, but you could switch it around. And the king is Cyril, and he's the other part of, there's the two parts of the ANC. Which part are you voting for? The really bad part is maybe as big as, and maybe even bigger than the good part. So I did not, I can tell you right now, I didn't vote ANC. I haven't voted ANC for a long time. But I didn't vote DA either. I voted for one of the small lefty parties, which didn't get enough votes to get a seat. But the point is that I think that is the big question for us at the moment. Which side of, which faction of the ANC is up, and can we try and work with the best people that we have and use the media and use the good civil society forces that we have to actually come out of this deep hole that we are still in because of Zuma, Gupta's, Ace Magashule, and a whole lot of other people in society who are deeply embedded with that lot.
Mm-hmm. And in this edition, you included cartoons from 2018 and 2019. Which ones stand out for you?
That's harder for me to say. I like the one of the late unlamented Gavin Watson, who's the Zondo's Flame Grilled, is kind of a Nando's parody. Parody is one of our great friends, as I mean, you can do parody cartoons. Oh, I'd say one of my favorites would be one of my ESCOM cartoons. It says, "Don't panic." They're called in ESCOM's technical task team, and the technical task team will, who's on that team? There's ET right at the front, who's got a built-in light bulb, so that's kind of nice to be on the ESCOM thing, and you've got a little, one of the minions lighting a light bulb with a big lighter, trying to light it that way. And, you know, it's kind of crazy. That's the sort of absurdist things you can do in cartoons, and I'd say that's probably one of my favorites. Yeah, and there would be some others.
Former President Jacob Zuma sued you for 5 million rand each for 3 cartoons you did about him during the time of his rape trial, but eventually dropped the case. He also launched a 7 million rand case against you for the Lady Justice cartoon, which he later dropped. How do you navigate those types of reaction to your work?
Fairly easily. I mean, it's only Jacob Zuma suing me, so it's not exactly somebody with integrity or somebody I actually have to take seriously. Look, he was the most powerful person in the country at the time. He wasn't president yet when he sued me. The first one was, as you say, 5 million for each of 3 cartoons, so 15 million. So it's a nonsense number. It's the biggest amount any cartoonist anywhere in the world has ever been sued for. It's twice the amount that anyone else has ever been sued for, because no one's ever been sued for more than $1 million US, and that's like $2 million US. Of course, then he sued me again in 2008. For the other one was 7 million. That's another $1 million US. So I suppose a grand total of 22 million at some point or another. But as I say, nonsense numbers, and the first lawsuit was 6 years for the ones at the end of the rape trial. The second lawsuit was 4 years, and eventually he dropped them. He pushed them right through into his presidency. How did I respond? Well, no, I'm not going to pretend that the second lawsuit did put me under a lot of pressure, because that Rape of Justice one was a very contentious cartoon. I still think it is the most important cartoon I've ever done, but it put me under a hell of a lot of pressure. There was Baleka and Bete and Zuma and Blade and Zamande and a number of others were screaming and shouting and calling me a rapist on a stage in front of 5,000 people after they got a favorable judgment at the Pietermaritzburg High Court, televised across the country. So that's many hundreds of thousands, or I think probably millions of people watching. That did put me under pressure. I was taken to the Human Rights Commission. They exonerated me. The lawsuit was eventually dropped. So, but the cartoon is also now on it's on a list of 15 cartoons that changed the world, which I know they didn't actually change the whole world, but cartoons from the last 200 years that have had an impact on the society in which they were drawn at the time. And mine is number 15, but it's there. So, no, so I feel I have been very much vindicated, and that to me is exactly how Zuma behaved before, during, and after his presidency. Yeah.
And lastly, your cartoons show that you have great insight into the goings on in South Africa. Are you optimistic about our country?
I keep getting asked a version of that kind of question. I'm sure you're asked, everybody's asked, but because I'm a cartoonist, I've got to come up with an answer. I go back to something I've been saying for 25 years. I am not a cynic, I'm a skeptic. And the difference for me, a cynic would really think that everything is, there's nothing to be gained from stuff that's all going down a big hole. And a skeptic is someone who's more about reading between the lines, not taking things at face value, and really trying to interrogate things. And in doing so, I'm always interested in what's going on. I'm passionate about what's going on. And I start to believe, I start to have hope. All those various forces I was talking about, the civil society, media, I think even some of the good people in some of the parties, and ordinary people just trying to do things in the most creative and interesting ways that they can, it's got to have an effect. And if we don't believe that we can pull ourselves out of where we are now, then we won't be able to do it. I mean, you at least have to have some belief and some hope. Otherwise, there's no chance. So I keep that little flame burning. There's a little shower with something trying to put it out all the time, but I'll keep that flame burning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Jonathan Shapiro, known as Zapiro, speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about his book titled Which Side Is Up?